The terrified flesh lump eater did exactly as he was told. The BFG signaled for some rope. A soldier rushed it over to him. With both the flesh lump eater's hands gripping his ankle, it was a simple matter for the BFG to tie the ankles and hands together with a tight knot. "I is pulling out the frightsome viper's teeth," the BFG said as he pulled the knot tight. "Do it quickly," shouted the flesh lump eater, "before I is pizened to death." "There we is," said the BFG, standing up. "You can look now." When the flesh lump eater saw that he was tossed up like a turkey, he gave up a yell so loud that the heavens trembled. He rolled and he wriggled, he fought and he figgled, he squirmed and he squiggled, but there was not a thing he could do. "Well done you," Sophie cried. "Well done you," said the BFG, smiling down at the little girl. "You is saving all our lives." "Will you please get the brooch back for me?" Sophie said. "It belongs to the Queen." The BFG pulled the beautiful brooch out of the flesh lump eater's ankle. The flesh lump eater howled. The BFG wiped the pin and handed back to Sophie. Curiously, not one of the other 8 snoring giants had woken up during this schmoozle. "When you is only sleeping 1 or 2 hours a day, you is sleeping extra doubly deep," the BFG explained. The heads of the Army and the Air Force drove forward once again in their jeep. "Her Majesty will be very pleased with me," the head of the Army said. "I shall probably get a medal. What's the next move?" "Now you is all driving over to my cave to load up my bottles of dreams," the BFG said. "We can't waste time with that rubbish," the Army General said. "It is the Queen's order," Sophie said. She was now back on the BFG's hand. So the 9 jeeps drove across to the BFG's cave, and the great dream loading operation began. There were 50,000 jars in all to be loaded up, and more than 5,000 to each jeep, and it took over an hour to finish the job. While the soldiers were loading the dreams, the BFG and Sophie disappeared over the mountain on a mysterious errand. When they came back, the BFG had a sack the size of a small house slung over his shoulder. "What's that you've got in there?" the head of the army demanded to know. "Curiosity is killing the rat," the BFG said, and he turned away from the silly man. When he was sure that all his precious dreams had been safely loaded onto the jeeps, the BFG said, "Now we is driving back to the belly poppers and picking up the frightsome giants." The jeeps dropped back to the helicopters. The 50,000 dreams were carried carefully, jar by jar, onto the helicopters. The soldiers climbed back on board, but the BFG and Sophie stayed on the ground. Then they all returned to where the 9 giants were lying. It was a fine sight to see them, these great air machines hovering over the trussed-up giants. It was an even finer sight to see the giants being woken up by the terrific thundering of the engines overhead, and the finest sight of all was to observe those 9 hideous brutes squirming and twisting about on the ground like a mass of mighty snakes as they tried to free themselves from their rope and chains. "I's flesh bungled," roared the flesh lump eater. "I's spittled wiggled," yelled the child chewer. "I's swalloped," bellowed the bone cruncher. "I's goose groggled," howled the man hugger. "I's gunzel whipped," shouted the meat dripper. "I's flock gungled," screamed the maid masher. "I's slop groggled," squawked the gizzard gulper. "I's crud squinkled," yowled the blood bottler. "I's bop muggered," screeched the butcher boy. The 9 giants carrying helicopters each chose a separate giant and hovered directly over him. Very strong steel hawsers with hooks on the end of them were lowered from the front and rear of each helicopter. The BFG quickly secured the hooks to the giant's chain, one hook near the legs and the other near the arm. Then the giants were winched up in the air, parallel with the ground. The giants roared and bellowed, but there was nothing they could do. The BFG, with Sophie once more resting comfortably in his ear, set off at a gallop for England. The helicopters all banked around and followed after him. It was an amazing spectacle. Those 9 helicopters winging through the sky, each with a trussed-up 50-foot-long giant slung underneath it. The giants themselves must have found it an interesting experience. They never stopped bellowing, but their howls were drowned by their noise of the engines. When it began to get dark, the helicopters switched on powerful searchlights and trained them on to the galloping giant, so as to keep him in sight. They flew right through the night and arrived in England just as dawn was breaking. Feeding time. While the giants were being captured, a tremendous bustle and hustle was going on back home in England. Every earth digger and mechanical contrivance in the whole country has been mobilized to dig up a colossal hole in which the 9 giants were to be permanently imprisoned. 10,000 men and 10,000 machines worked ceaselessly through the night under powerful arc lights, and the massive task was completed only just in time. The hole itself was about twice the size of a football field and 500 feet deep. The walls were perpendicular, and engineers had calculated that there was no way a giant could escape once he was put in. Even if all 9 giants were to stand on each other's shoulders, the topmost giant would still be some 50 level from the top of the hole. The 9 giant-carrying helicopters hovered over the massive pit. The giants, one by one, were lowered to the floor, but they were still trussed up, and now came the tricky business of releasing them from their bonds. Nobody wanted to go down and to do this, because the moment a giant was freed, he would be sure to turn on the wretched person who had freed him and gobble him up. As usual, the BFG had the answer. "I was told you before," he said. "Giant is never eating giants, so I is going down, and I shall untie them before you can say Rack Joppinson." With thousands of fascinated spectators, including the Queen, peering down into the pit, the BFG was lowered up, stretched their stiffened limbs, and started leaping about in a fury. "Why is they putting us down here, in this grub-sludging hole?" they shouted at the BFG. "Because you is guzzling human beings," the BFG answered. "I is always warning you not to do it, and you is never taking the titchiest bit of notice." "In that case," the flush lump eater bellowed, "I think we is guzzling you instead." The BFG grabbed the dangling rope and was hoisted out of the pit just in time. The great bulging sack he had brought back with him from giant country lay at the top of the pit. "What's in there?" the Queen asked him. The BFG put an arm into the sack and pulled out a gigantic black and white stripped object the size of a man. "Snowscumber," he cried. "This is the repulsant snowscumber, Magister, and that is all we is going to give these disgusting giants from now on." "May I taste it?" the Queen asked. "Don't, Magister, don't," cried the BFG. "It is tasting of trog filth and pig squibble." With that he tossed the snowscumber down to the giants below. "There's your supper," he shouted. "Have a munch on that." He fished out more snowscumbers from the sack and threw them down. The giants below howled and cursed. The BFG laughed. "It serves them right, left and center," he said. "What will we feed them on when the snowscumbers are all used up?" the Queen asked him. "They is never being used up, Magister," the BFG answered smilingly. "I is also bringing in this sack a whole bungle of snowscumber plants, which I is giving with your permission to the royal gardener to put in the soil. Then we is having an everlasting supplies of this repulsant food to feed these thirst-blooded giants on." "What a clever fellow you are," the Queen said. "You are not very well educated, but you are really nobody's fool. I can see that." The author. Every country in the world that had in the past been visited by the foul, man-eating giant sent telegrams of the kings and presidents and prime ministers and rulers of every kind, showered the enormous giant and the little girl with compliments and thank yous, as well as all sorts of medals and presents. The ruler of India sent the BFG a magnificent elephant, the very thing he had been wishing for all his life. The king of Arabia sent them a camel each. The Lama of Tibet sent them a llama each. Wellington sent them 100 pairs of wellies each. Panama sent them beautiful hats. The king of Sweden sent them a barrelful of sweet and sour pork. Jersey sent them pullovers. There was no end to the gratitude of the world. The Queen herself gave orders that a special house with tremendous high ceilings and enormous doors should immediately be built in Windsor Great Park, next to her own castle, for the BFG to live in. And a pretty little cottage was put up next door for Sophie.